It was October of 2018 when I decided to get away for a while. I had just turned 32, and I was going through a stretch where nothing in life felt right. My job as a city maintenance inspector in Little Rock, Arkansas, had turned into the same thing every day. Check a cracked sidewalk, write up a pothole, argue about budgets. I needed something quiet, something slower. No people, no noise, just time to breathe and reset. So when my cousin Peter mentioned his late uncle's old hunting cabin up in the northern woods of Arkansas, I took the chance. Peter had used it once in the summer a few years back. Said it was rough but quiet. No electricity, no water line, but there was a stream nearby and a working stove that ran off an old propane tank. The best part was it sat next to an old graveyard tucked into a clearing. Sounded odd, but he said it wasn't creepy, just peaceful. I packed up a few supplies in the back of my old gray SUV. Canned food, a camping stove just in case, extra blankets, flashlight, batteries, a notebook, a few tools, and a 12-gauge shotgun I use sometimes when hunting deer with friends. I didn't plan to hunt, but being alone in the woods, it made me feel better to have it. Took about 4 hours to drive up there. The last 40 minutes were on a narrow gravel road that twisted through pine trees and dipped low in places where runoff water had eroded the ground. It was late afternoon by the time I arrived. The trees had already turned gold and orange, and the air had that smell of dry leaves and cold bark. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just a one-room place with a metal chimney poking out the roof and a little porch in front. There were a couple of broken chairs out front, a plastic water barrel off to the side, and some moss growing around the base where would met dirt. Behind the cabin, just 30 or 40 steps through the trees, was the graveyard. No fence, just maybe 24 headstones, most old and gray, with a few leaning over like they'd been forgotten for a long time. I stood there for a while just looking at it. The names were mostly German-sounding, some going back to the early 1900s. A few newer ones from the 70s or 80s. One small headstone had nothing but the word baby carved into it. No date, no last name. It was quiet, no wind, just the creak of the trees. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, laid my sleeping bag on the old cot inside the cabin, and read by flashlight for a while. The night got cold fast. I could hear the woods creaking outside, little snaps of branches now and then. I figured it was just animals. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't scared, just wired from the change in environment. The second day, I walked the woods around the cabin. I didn't go far, maybe a half mile in each direction. The land sloped down eastward where I found the stream Peter had mentioned. Cold, clear water moving over smooth rocks. I filled a few bottles. On my way back, I spotted what looked like an old trail. Nothing clear, but just a part of the woods where the ground looked worn and the underbrush thinned. I followed it a bit until I saw an old wooden post sticking out of the ground. Just one, broken and weathered, like maybe there had once been a fence or a marker. I left it alone and went back. That night, things started feeling off. I was writing in my notebook when I heard something outside. A thump, not sharp, not sudden, just a dull, solid sound like something dropping onto the ground. I turned off my light and listened. Silence. Then after a few minutes, I heard it again, this time closer to the front porch. My heart was beating fast. I grabbed the shotgun and stepped quietly to the window. The moon was out so I could see the front yard. Trees, dead leaves, my SUV, nothing else. Still, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake with the gun across my lap, flashlight in the other hand, until the sky began to turn pale. On the third day, I checked around the cabin. Didn't find anything unusual, but near the back corner of the porch, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A spot where the leaves had been moved. Just a small, clear circle of dirt, like someone had scooped leaves out of the way and left the ground bare. I touched it, still a little damp. I went to the graveyard again, thinking maybe some animal had wandered through. A few stones had lichen growing on them that I hadn't seen before, but that wasn't strange. What was strange was that one of the headstones, one I clearly remembered being tilted, was now standing straight up. I stared at it for a long time. It was a square headstone with the name Matthias Kruger, 1903 to 1931. A small stone. Last time it had been leaning to the right at an angle. Now it stood perfectly level, like someone had fixed it overnight. There were no footprints, just dry leaves and tree roots. That night I kept the fire going hot. I didn't want silence around me. I dragged one of the old porch chairs inside and put it against the door. Not because I thought it would stop anything, just because it made me feel better. Around midnight I heard it again. The same thump, this time followed by a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the leaves. I stayed still, barely breathed. Then came the sound of the steps on the porch. Not running, not heavy, just slow, careful steps. I raised the shotgun and pointed it at the door. My flashlight was off. I didn't want to give myself away. The steps stopped right at the door. I could hear the wood creak under pressure. Then silence. Long silence. I don't know how long I stood there, finger on the trigger. Eventually, the sound moved again, back down the steps, away from the cabin. Then nothing. In the morning, I opened the door and checked. There were fresh drag marks in the dirt. Not footprints, just long, sweeping marks like something had been pulled away from the porch and into the woods. I followed them. They led past the graveyard and down the slope a ways, then disappeared into the underbrush. I didn't follow further. I considered packing up and leaving right then. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a bear or some kind of animal dragging something. But it didn't sit right.
No claw marks. No fur.
No torn up ground like you usually see when animals move things. On the 5th day, I woke up and found a small wooden box sitting on the edge of the graveyard. It hadn't been there before. It was carved from a single block of wood, about the size of a shoebox. No lock, just a lid. I didn't open it at first. I just stood staring at it. Eventually, I took a stick and flipped the lid open. Inside was a dead squirrel. Clean. No blood. No injuries. Just stiff, like it had been placed gently inside. And next to it, a small piece of yellowed paper with faded handwriting that looked like German. I don't speak or read German, but one word stood out, bleiben. I looked it up later. It means stay. That night was the worst. I locked the door, loaded the shotgun. I barely breathed as I sat in the dark. No fire.
No flashlight.
Just me listening. It started with the porch steps again. But this time it didn't stop at the door. I heard movement around the cabin. Crunching leaves. Then a tap on the back wall. Then on the side window.
Top. Top.
Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. Then the steps came back to the front door. I waited. Suddenly, something hit the door hard. 1, 2, 3 times, like a battering ram. Then silence again. The worst part? I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, frozen. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found deep gouges in the doorframe. 3 parallel lines carved into the wood. Not claw marks, too even, too straight. Like someone used a knife or a chisel. I packed my gear. I had planned to stay a week, but I was done. I started the SUV and turned onto the gravel road. As I passed the graveyard, I slowed. A man was standing there. He was maybe 50 feet from the road, wearing dark clothes, standing among the headstones with his back to me. Not moving, just standing. I didn't stop. I didn't honk. I just kept driving. Back in Little Rock, I told Peter what happened. He said the cabin had belonged to his uncle's family for years, and they used to let some local man look after it. But he stopped coming around after 2002. No one heard from him after that, just disappeared. The graveyard, it had been there long before the cabin. The locals called it Krieger Hill, after some German immigrant families that settled the area a century ago. I never went back. I sold my shotgun. I stopped camping altogether. I still think about that box, that squirrel, the drag marks, the man in the graveyard. I think someone lives out there, still, watching the graves, moving things, fixing stones, waiting, and whatever they're doing, they don't want company. I'm not really sure what made me want to go up to that old cabin again. It was in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep in the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania. The place belonged to my dad's side of the family and had been mostly unused since my uncle passed away in 2013. I was 31 at the time this happened, 2021, and I had just been laid off from a construction job. The stress had been piling up, and I figured I needed to get away from people, internet, phones, everything. I thought a few quiet nights at the cabin might help clear my head. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived in Harrisburg. I packed up my old Ford F-150 with a cooler full of food, some canned stuff, a camp stove just in case, sleeping gear, and a .22 rifle I kept more out of habit than necessity. I didn't expect to need it. There wasn't much around that area except black bears, and they usually stayed away. It was mid-September. The weather was getting cooler, especially in the mountains. The trees were just starting to change color. The roads were narrow and winding as I got closer to the property, and cell service started cutting out about an hour before I reached the place. The final road up to the cabin was nothing more than a dirt path, overgrown and barely visible. I remembered the turns from when I was a kid visiting with my uncle during hunting season. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked exactly how I remembered it. Grayish wood, slanted tin roof, single chimney, and a little front porch with a sagging step. The grass around it was tall, like no one had been there in years, which was pretty accurate. I cut the engine and just sat there for a minute with the window rolled down, listening. The forest was quiet, not dead quiet, just peaceful. Wind rustling through the trees, a few birds chirping here and there, the occasional distant crack of a branch. I got out, stretched, and grabbed my gear from the back. The front door stuck a bit when I pushed it open, but it gave way with a loud creak. Inside, the air was stale, but everything was intact. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a table with 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove against the back wall. To the right, an old cot with a thin mattress and a pile of folded wool blankets sat under the window. A few shelves lined the walls, holding rusted lanterns, old books, and dusty mason jars. I dropped my bag and took a slow walk through the place, checking everything. The back door led to a tiny outhouse a few yards away. No signs of animals breaking in, no vandalism, nothing odd. I was surprised how well the place had held up. I spent the rest of the day clearing some of the tall grass around the porch, sweeping out dust and cobwebs, and getting a small fire going in the stove to warm things up. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, I was sitting on the porch with a beer in my hand, listening to the distant sounds of the woods and feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. That night, I slept hard, the kind of sleep that hits you when you're bone tired. I woke up once to pee, stepped out the front door into the cold air, and stared at the sky for a while. It was clear, and the stars looked sharp enough to touch. No light pollution, no noise. I stood there barefoot in the dirt for a while, just listening. The next day was mostly the same. I spent time cutting some firewood, hiking a little up the trail behind the cabin, and cooking some beans over the stove. I read a few pages of a book I found on one of the shelves. By late afternoon, clouds started rolling in. The temperature dropped, and I figured there'd be rain overnight. I collected some dry wood, filled a couple of pots with water from the rain barrel, and double-checked the latch on the back door. It started raining around midnight. I was half asleep when it began. Just a soft patter at first, then a steady drum on the tin roof. Felt cozy at first, but then I heard something else, a kind of crunching sound from outside. I opened my eyes. It was pitch black inside the cabin except for the orange glow from the stove. The crunch came again, slow, deliberate. Footsteps in wet leaves. My heart kicked a little harder. I sat up slowly and listened. The sound stopped. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon nosing around. I told myself not to overthink it, but something about the timing felt off. I sat there for another few minutes, then grabbed my flashlight and rifle, opened the front door, and scanned the yard. Rain came down in sheets now, and the beam from the flashlight cut through it in a wide arc. Nothing, just trees, tall grass, the outline of the outhouse. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed, feeling kind of foolish. I was just spooking myself, but I didn't sleep that well after that. Next morning, the rain had stopped. The ground was soaked, and mist clung low to the trees. I stepped out and looked around. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. I had work boots, and these prints were narrower, deeper at the heel. Looked like sneakers or maybe light hiking shoes. They came in from the trail and circled around the side of the cabin. I followed them as far as the soft ground would let me before they vanished into thicker brush. I felt something twist in my stomach. I hadn't heard any vehicles. There weren't any neighbors nearby. The trail to the cabin was so hidden and unmarked. Even most locals didn't know it was there. I went back inside and locked the doors, then checked all the windows. Nothing broken, nothing moved. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to go about my day like normal. Read a bit, ate something, did a short walk around the area with the rifle slung over my back. But my brain kept circling back to the footsteps. Who the hell had been out here? What were they doing? That night, I didn't sleep. I laid on the cot, staring at the ceiling. I kept the lantern lit, the rifle within arm's reach. The rain had passed, and everything outside was quiet again. Around 2 a.m., I heard the slightest creak of wood. It sounded like the floorboard near the back of the cabin. I sat up fast, heart pounding. I waited, straining my ears. Another soft creak. There was no wind. Nothing should be making that sound. I stood up, grabbed the rifle, and walked slow toward the back wall, past the stove. I held my breath. My fingers were sweaty on the stock. Then the sound came again, louder this time. Not from outside, from inside. Somewhere near the far corner, maybe by the shelf. I lifted the lantern and swept the light over the room. That's when I noticed the trapdoor. I had forgotten it even existed. My uncle had built a root cellar under the cabin, just big enough for some canned goods and emergency supplies. I didn't remember seeing it the day I arrived, but now it was clear. The wooden outline in the floorboards, with a rusted iron ring as a handle. The trapdoor was cracked open by less than an inch. I stood completely still. My breathing was sharp and fast. I hadn't touched the cellar, hadn't opened it, and the dust around the handle was disturbed. Someone had. There was no noise now, nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like 20 minutes, staring at that gap, every muscle tensed. Then I backed away slowly, rifle still raised, and moved to the door. I stepped outside into the cold night air and circled the cabin. The back window was open. It had been shut when I arrived. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, that I'd left it open without remembering. But the dirt smudges on the window frame told me otherwise. Someone had been in the cabin, and they were probably still inside. I didn't go back in. I got in my truck, turned the key, and backed out fast, headlights cutting across the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the paved road. I didn't call the cops right away. There wasn't even signal until I reached town an hour later. I pulled into a diner parking lot and sat there in the driver's seat, replaying everything in my head. Eventually, I made the call. A deputy met me at the edge of the county and followed me back to the cabin. When we got there, the front door was still locked, just like I'd left it. But when we went inside, the trapdoor was wide open. The cellar was empty, not even shelves anymore, just dirt walls and a concrete floor. But in the corner, we found an old sleeping bag, some empty water bottles, a torn backpack, and a pocket knife. He'd been living under the cabin, watching me, probably from the moment I arrived. The deputy told me they'd had a few cases like that, drifters, squatters, people living off-grid or hiding from something. But the location of the cabin made it all the more strange. This wasn't a place you stumbled across. You had to know about it. We never found the guy. They searched the woods for a few days but turned up nothing. I never went back. A month later, I sold the cabin. Cheap. I didn't care. I just wanted to be done with it. Even now, I still think about it sometimes. How quiet he must have been. How close he was while I slept. How he moved around without making a sound. I wonder what would have happened if I had opened that trapdoor that night. Or worse, if he had decided to come up instead. But most of all, I wonder how long he had been staying there before I showed up. And how many others might have come and gone without ever realizing he was underneath them, listening the whole time. It was September 2021 when I decided to take some time away from everything. I had just turned 35. Work had been a mess, and the city had started to wear me down in ways I didn't fully notice until I stopped waking up without dread every day. So I took a week off and drove from Coeur d'Alene up into Montana with my dog, Tucker. He was a 5-year-old mutt, part lab, part something scrappy. Just over 70 pounds, dark tan coat, white chest, friendly as hell, but alert, Real alert. I trust his instincts more than most people. I rented a small cabin just north of Lincoln, way out past the gravel roads, tucked against the edge of Lolo National Forest. The guy who owned it was an older man who lived in a trailer a couple of miles back down the main road. I found the listing on an old website that hadn't been updated in years, but it was cheap, the pictures looked fine, and I wanted something without Wi-Fi, without neighbors, without any noise except wind and trees and Tucker's paws against the dirt. It was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin itself wasn't anything special. Old wood, cedar, I think, probably built in the 70s. It had a front porch with a sagging rail and a view over a narrow draw. Tall grass, scattered rocks, trees choking the slopes. No electricity except from a small gas generator. No plumbing either, just a big blue jug for water and an outhouse maybe 50 feet away tucked in the woods. But the place had a roof, for walls, a wood stove, and enough space to throw my sleeping bag on the floor. That was good enough for me. Tucker liked it right away. First thing he did when I opened the truck door was jump out and bolt in a circle around the clearing, nose to the ground, tail up. His bark echoed once, sharp and happy. The air smelled clean and dry, like pine and earth. It was the kind of silence you don't realize you miss until you're back in it. The first 2 days were quiet. I hiked a bit with Tucker, cooked simple meals over my little gas stove, and sat on the porch until it got dark. Read an old paperback I brought with me. At night it got cold, but I had the wood stove going. Tucker curled up at my feet and didn't move much. He liked the quiet too. On the third day, something shifted. I couldn't say exactly what at first. It started small. Tucker began acting a little strange. He didn't want to wander as far from the cabin. Normally, he'd disappear into the woods for 10 or 15 minutes, sniffing around, tail wagging. But that day, he stayed close, sat near the porch most of the morning. Every so often, he'd lift his head and stare out toward the woods behind the cabin. No bark. Just alert, ears perked, muscles stiff. I thought maybe it was a deer. There were signs of them around, tracks in the dirt, scat near the edge of the trees. Could have been a bear, too. Maybe a cougar. I wasn't too concerned at first. This was their home more than mine. I kept my bear spray on my hip and didn't stray too far. But Tucker didn't settle. He kept staring into the trees, and later that afternoon, when we were walking along the ridgeline trail about a half-mile from the cabin, he stopped dead and growled. Not the kind of playful growl he gave when he wanted to wrestle. This was low and steady, throat deep. His body tensed, head down, teeth just barely bared. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were trees. Nothing moved.
No birds. No roostle.
Just woods. We turned back. That night I had trouble sleeping. There was a scratching sound outside the cabin. Not loud, but enough to get my attention. I sat up in my bag, listened. Tucker was already awake. His head was up, ears forward. I reached for the flashlight beside me and clicked it on. The noise stopped. I waited. Silence. Then I heard it again. Light like fingernails or something small dragging over wood. It was coming from the back wall of the cabin. Tucker was growling now, just low enough that I could feel it more than hear it. I put on my boots, picked up the flashlight, and stepped outside with Tucker right behind me. I moved around the side of the cabin, the beam of light jumping across the wood siding. Nothing. The generator was still off. I'd shut it down before dark to save fuel. I kept the light low, scanning the edges. Then I found it. A long scratch, 3 of them actually, cut into the wood about waist high, each about 6 inches long. Fresh. The wood was light underneath where it had been scraped. I knelt down to look closer. The edges were sharp, clean, no rot. Whatever made those marks did it recently. Could have been a bear, but they usually stand up and go vertical when they scratch. These were horizontal. I stayed outside a while longer, scanning the tree-line, but never saw anything. Tucker wouldn't stop pacing. His paws crunched over the gravel in a tight circle. Tail down, ears back. He didn't want to go near the back of the cabin. Eventually, I went inside and locked the door. Not that the old latch would have stopped anything serious. The next day, I didn't do much. Spent most of it near the cabin, collected more wood, and cleaned the shotgun I'd brought for emergencies. It was a Remington 870 I'd had since I was 21. Reliable. I loaded it with slugs and kept it leaned against the inside wall near the door. That night, it got worse. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to Tucker barking. Not just barking, but howling like something was right outside. I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun and ran to the door. I didn't even hesitate. I swung it open and stepped out. Tucker was at the edge of the porch, hackles raised, barking into the dark like he wanted to tear something apart. I scanned the woods with the light. Again, nothing. But I could hear something this time. Movement. Heavy. Something crashing through brush just out of view. Not fast, not slow. Deliberate. I tried to get a sense of distance, maybe 50 feet out. I kept the beam steady and waited, heart pounding. I didn't want to shoot unless I saw something clearly. Then I caught a flash of movement between 2 trees. A shape dark, upright. It moved quickly, but not like an animal. Too smooth. Passed through the trees in a way that made my skin crawl. I raised the shotgun, but it was already gone. No sound now, just my breathing and Tucker's low growl. He didn't stop until almost 15 minutes later. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I hiked out to the trees where I'd seen the shape. There were broken branches, flattened grass, but no tracks. The ground was dry, too dry to hold much. I followed the signs as far as I could, maybe 60 or 70 feet into the woods. Then they stopped. No direction, no clue where it went. I didn't like it. I thought about packing up and leaving early. I only had 2 nights left anyway, but I'd come here to get away, and part of me didn't want to be scared off by something I hadn't even seen clearly. So I stayed. Stupid, maybe, but I stayed. That evening, I moved my sleeping bag so it was closer to the stove and farther from the back wall. I propped a piece of scrap metal, an old baking sheet I found behind the cabin, against the window so it wouldn't rattle in the wind. Tucker didn't want to eat. He just laid near the door, head down, tail thumping the floor once in a while when I looked at him. He was nervous. I was too. It was almost midnight when I heard the first knock. Not a crash, not a branch breaking. A knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks on the back wall of the cabin. It was so deliberate it made my blood run cold. I sat up instantly. Tucker was already growling again, deep and mean. I grabbed the flashlight and shotgun and moved to the door. This time I didn't open it. I waited. The knocks came again. Same spot, back wall. Exactly 3. Slow, solid. Tucker was barking now, feral, violent. He didn't sound like the same dog. He lunged at the door, then turned in a circle, then back to the door. I moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to shine the light toward the trees. Nothing. Then something moved at the edge of the woods, just outside the beam. I shifted the light. It was a person, or I thought it was. It stood too still, arms long at the sides, head tilted slightly. I couldn't make out details, just the shape. They didn't move, just stood there. I said nothing, just kept the light on it, finger tight on the trigger. Then it turned and walked into the trees. Not ran, not stumbled. Walked like it had done this before, like it knew exactly where it was going. I didn't sleep that night either. At first light, I packed up. I didn't even make coffee. Threw everything into the back of the truck, grabbed Tucker's leash, and we were gone before the sun cleared the ridge. I didn't report it. What would I say? A shape in the woods? Scratches on the cabin? Someone knocked on the wall? There were no cameras, no proof. Just me, my dog, and the kind of fear you only understand if you've looked at something in the woods that looked back. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed that last night, or opened the door, or followed the shape into the trees. I try not to think about it too much. Tucker never went near the forest again. Even back home, he avoided wooded trails, stuck to sidewalks and open fields. He'd look at the tree leans sometimes, just stare like he was waiting for something to come out. Whatever was out there that week, it wasn't an animal. And it wasn't a ghost either. It was something worse, something real. And that's why I don't go to the woods alone anymore. Back in 2016, I took a trip alone into the hills of western Pennsylvania. I was 33 at the time, working a construction job in Harrisburg. I'd been burned out, physically and mentally, and when my boss offered me 2 weeks off unpaid, I took it without thinking twice. I didn't tell anybody where I was going, not even my sister. I just packed up my beat-up Chevy Silverado, grabbed my hunting gear, and drove west with no real plan. I ended up in Fayette County, a rougher part of the state, mostly woods and old mining land. My plan was simple: camp in the woods, fish the rivers, maybe do some solo hunting if I spotted deer. But the real reason was to just be far from people. I needed quiet, the kind that only happens when there's no cell signal and no cars on a distant road. I found a dirt road that cut off from a small highway just past a forgotten-looking town called Dawson. The road twisted deep into the trees, and after almost an hour of careful driving, it dumped me near a dead clearing. There was a chain-link fence that had been pushed down, half buried in leaves and mud. I got out, looked around, and noticed an old quarry on one side, maybe half a mile wide, filled partially with dark water. You could tell it had been shut down years ago. Rusted machines sat where they were last used, now covered in vines. Opposite the quarry, hidden behind a wall of skinny trees, was a small cabin. It didn't look like much from a distance, Single level, gray wood, tin roof, probably no more than 2 or 3 rooms inside. But the door wasn't boarded up. There were no trespassing signs, and the area didn't feel like anybody had touched it in years. I figured it'd be safer than a tent, at least for a few nights. I backed my truck in through the broken fence, parked it near the trees, and walked up to the cabin. It was musty inside, smelled like rotted leaves and old wood. The floor creaked but held steady, and the windows were grimy but unbroken. There was an old cot with a stained mattress in one corner and a rusted wood stove near the center. Someone had left a metal chair and a few rotted cans of beans on a dusty shelf, but nothing else. It didn't feel haunted or anything like that, just forgotten, like people stopped coming here because it wasn't worth the effort anymore. I swept the place out with a branch broom I made, then laid out my sleeping bag on the cot. That night, I started a small fire in the stove using some half-dry wood I found out back. I heated up some canned soup I'd brought and sat there with my boots off, listening to the fire crackle while the wind pushed against the tin roof. Felt good, quiet. I even fell asleep fast, which usually never happens when I'm in a new place. But around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up freezing. The fire had died out. The cabin was pitch black. I didn't hear any weird sounds or anything like that, just silence. I tossed on my coat and got back in the sleeping bag. That's when I noticed it. The front door was open. Not wide open, just maybe 6 inches or so. I didn't remember leaving it unlatched. I got up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it toward the door. Nothing, just trees and darkness outside. I walked over, shut the door, bolted it, and then sat back down on the cot. I couldn't sleep after that. Not because I was scared, but because my mind wouldn't stop wondering if someone had come by. Maybe just some hunter who noticed the truck and got curious. Still, it bugged me. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around the clearing. Nothing was disturbed. No fresh tracks, no broken twigs, no signs that anyone had been near the place. I chalked it up to the wind. Maybe the door didn't shut right, and a gust blew it open. Either way, I stayed alert that day. I hiked along the edge of the quarry, went down to the water's edge, and found some old tires and rusted tools submerged in the shallows. I fished for a while but caught nothing. Still, it was peaceful. That night, I made a stronger fire in the stove and even propped a chair under the door handle just in case. I kept my .45 loaded and by my sleeping bag. I slept better that night. Woke up a few times, but the door stayed shut. On the 3rd day, I noticed something new. About 100 feet behind the cabin, deep in the trees, I found a small trail I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a hiking trail or anything marked. It looked like an old path made from boots, maybe used by hunters or quarry workers long ago. I followed it for half a mile, weaving through thick brush and ducking under fallen trees. It led me to another structure, a shack made of sheet metal and rotted lumber. Smaller than the cabin, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. I didn't go inside. There was a smell coming from it. Not death exactly, but moldy, wet, like old garbage mixed with oil. I circled around it, noticed a broken lock on the front, and a heavy-duty shovel leaning against the back wall. The earth around the shack was uneven, like something had been dug and poorly refilled. That gave me pause. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I had no signal, and walked back to the cabin before it got dark. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept imagining what that shack was for, why it was so far from the quarry, why someone had dug up the ground behind it. I kept the fire hot, my weapon close. Every time the wind shifted or a branch snapped, I held my breath. On the 4th morning, I decided to leave. I had enough. I packed up my gear, tossed my trash into a bag, and started loading the truck. But when I got in the cab and turned the key, nothing happened. Dead. Not even a click. The battery was fine when I'd parked it. The lights still worked. I opened the hood and checked the cables. Both were tight. I turned the key again. Nothing, not even a sound. I knew it wasn't normal. Even if the starter had gone, I should have heard something. It felt like the ignition itself was disconnected. But I wasn't a mechanic, and I was at least an hour from the highway by foot. So I walked. I took the same dirt road I'd driven in on, now on foot with my pack slung over one shoulder and my weapon holstered. I walked for maybe 45 minutes. Then I saw the car. It was a dark green SUV, maybe a decade old, parked halfway off the road. No license plates. The windows were tinted black. No sign of movement. No tire marks in the dirt, which meant it had been there for a while, maybe before I arrived. But I hadn't seen it when I drove in. I didn't stop walking. I just slowed down and passed it, head forward, not looking too long. About another mile down the road, I saw something worse. A shirt, just lying in the middle of the road. Faded red flannel, torn along the bottom. I walked right past it but marked the location in my head. Another 100 yards, a boot. Old leather, size 11 maybe, with a cracked sole. It was like someone had been walking ahead of me, shedding things as they went. That's when I turned back. I didn't like it. The SUV, the shirt, the boot. None of it felt right. I walked back to the cabin, heart pounding the whole way, stopping every few minutes to listen. When I got to the clearing again, my truck was just as I left it. But now there were fresh prints near the driver's door. Big ones, wider than mine, deep in the dirt like someone heavy had stood there for a long time. I backed away from the truck and went straight into the woods. I didn't go back to the shack or the trail. I cut a new path through the brush, climbing uphill until I found a rock outcrop big enough to sleep behind. I stayed there that night, no fire, just wrapped up tight in my sleeping bag with my weapon in my hands. In the morning, I made a plan. Hike directly east until I found the highway. It'd be a longer walk, but safer. I ditched the cabin, the truck, everything but water, food, and my gun. I moved fast, didn't rest, didn't eat unless I was walking. I followed the sun and my compass, crossed 2 small creeks, and finally hit pavement near mid-afternoon. A family in a silver minivan picked me up. I told them my truck had broken down and left out the rest. They dropped me off in town. I called a tow company from a diner and gave them rough directions to the clearing. The guy said he'd go out the next day. 2 days later, I got a call. They found my truck, still parked, battery ripped out, wires under the hood cut clean with a blade, and something else. In the bed of the truck, buried under my spare tarp, they found a hunting knife. Not mine. Dried blood on the handle, wrapped in an old red flannel shirt. I didn't go back for the truck. Told them they could keep it. Sold it for scrap through the tow company and never stepped foot in Fayette County again. Whatever was out there, whoever was watching, wasn't just some drifter or curious hunter. Someone had been living out there, watching that trail, watching the cabin. They saw me walk in, and they didn't like me walking out. And the scariest part? I think they were going to wait until I fell asleep. One more night, and I don't think I would have walked out of those woods at all. I was 34 when I finally decided to go off the grid for a while. It wasn't some dramatic midlife crisis or anything like that. I didn't lose a job or have a mental breakdown. I think I just got tired of people always buzzing around, asking for things, sending messages. I'd worked construction since I was 19, and I'd saved enough over the years to take a long break. Maybe a year, maybe more. I wasn't sure. It was September 2023 when I loaded up my truck with basic supplies: tools, nails, a chainsaw, a couple of tarps, canned food, dry goods, some solar-powered lights, and a thick roll of plastic sheeting. I had a German Shepherd named Clyde who I took with me everywhere. I didn't have a wife or kids anymore. My ex-wife, Sandra, and I had split a few years back. I didn't want to talk about her back then, And even now, I don't like remembering what happened between us. Let's just say some things fall apart and stay that way. I had scoped out this small piece of land a few miles south of Missoula, Montana, in a quiet wooded area not far from a narrow dirt road that didn't get much use. I knew someone who knew someone and managed to get permission to stay on the land long-term as long as I didn't build anything permanent. That was fine by me. I was only going to build a small cabin, more like a hunting shack, temporary, but sturdy, just something to keep me dry and off the ground. The plan was simple. I'd camp the first few nights in a small tent until I could throw up 4 walls, a roof, and maybe a stove vent. I keep it small, something like 10 by 12 feet.
No plumbing.
Just a cot, my tools, some storage bins, and a barrel stove for heat. I had done this kind of stuff for clients 100 times. I figured it would be easy. I'd even enjoy it. But things don't always go how you picture them. The first day was beautiful. Warm air, leaves just starting to turn yellow. I parked the truck on a patch of gravel near the treeline and walked the perimeter of where I wanted to build. The soil was firm but not frozen, and there was no sign of flooding or erosion. I took out my stakes and flagged the corners of the build. I ran string lines and started digging small holes for the support posts. Clyde followed me around like he always did, sniffing at the air and disappearing into the trees once in a while. He never went far. He was a smart dog, strong too, built like a tank. By sunset, I had the ground cleared and leveled. I made a fire, ate some chili from a can, and lay back in my tent listening to the forest. I didn't hear anything weird, just whined through the pines and a few owls. I slept easy. The second day, I got the floor frame set. I used pressure-treated 4x4s I brought with me and nailed down plywood sheets over the joists. I wasn't worried about making it pretty, just solid. The walls would come next. I worked all afternoon, sweat running down my neck, feeling good. Clyde laid under the truck when it got hot, tongue out, watching squirrels. Around 5 p.m., clouds rolled in from the west. I'd seen the forecast, said there might be showers, but I figured I'd have enough time to at least frame 2 walls. Then it started pouring. Not light rain, sheets of water, like someone flipped a switch. I ran around grabbing tools, throwing a tarp over the stack of wood, yelling at Clyde to get in the truck bed. The temperature dropped fast. By the time I climbed inside the tent, I was soaked, and the canvas walls were already leaking. That night was miserable. The tent felt like a sponge, and every gust of wind made the seams groan. I kept a small flashlight looped around my wrist, and every so often I'd shine it at the tent wall where the rain pounded hardest. Clyde whined a few times but stayed curled up by my legs. I didn't sleep much. Something about that kind of rain. It makes you feel watched, not in a spooky way, just like the world is right outside the fabric wall and pushing closer. Morning came gray and colder. My boots were still wet. I used a propane burner to heat up coffee and bacon, standing under the truck's tailgate for shelter. Everything smelled like damp soil and pine sap. The floor frame had held up, but the top layer of dirt was slop. Clyde's paws left prints all over the plywood. I pushed through anyway. That third day, I got 3 of the walls up, enough to block some of the wind. I hung a tarp across the top like a makeshift roof and started measuring for a doorway. I was cold, tired, and hungry, but it felt like progress. I told myself maybe another 2 days and I'd be sleeping inside. That night, the rain came back harder. I lay in the tent again, curled in a sleeping bag, boots off but damp from the inside out. Around 1 a.m., I heard something, branches snapping. At first I thought maybe a deer, but then I heard a loud clack, like wood against wood. Clyde growled low in his throat. I froze, not out of fear, just out of habit. You don't move when you hear something unfamiliar in the dark. You listen. The snapping moved around the perimeter of the tent. Not fast, slow, careful steps. Clyde stood up and pressed against the wall, nose twitching. Then silence, just the rain. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention. For 10, maybe 15 minutes, I waited. Eventually, I heard wet footsteps retreating. Heavy. Not like boots, but not light like a deer. No running, just walking away. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I found tracks. Bare feet. Human.
Nos shoes.
Big two, at least size 12. Toes splayed wide like someone used to walking barefoot. The prints circled the tent, then walked straight into the woods. I didn't know what to think. Could have been a squatter, a drifter, or just someone messing with me. But why barefoot? And out here, in cold mud? I checked the supplies. Nothing missing, but it rattled me. I loaded the shotgun I brought for bears and kept it close from that point on. I never needed to use it before, but I wasn't going to take chances. I finished the cabin on day 5. It wasn't pretty, but it was strong. For walls, a roof, a bolted door, and a small vent pipe sticking through the back wall. I moved my gear inside, laid out the cot, and put a rubber mat by the door for Clyde. I felt safer in there. The thick pine boards dulled the sound of the wind, and the small window I'd cut near the corner let me see into the trees. That night, I lit a candle inside a tin can, just enough to glow. Clyde slept with his head near the door. I sat with my back to the wall, holding the shotgun loosely across my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Steps, not close, but out there. The same heavy, deliberate pace. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a second. Just listened. A few minutes passed. Then silence again. When I woke up the next morning, I found muddy prints near the fire pit. This time, they led to the back of the cabin. I followed them until they vanished in the wet pine needles. Still barefoot. Still just one set. Over the next few days, I started noticing things moved. Small things. My hammer was sitting on the edge of the porch when I knew I left it by the door. A pile of split wood looked smaller than before. A can of beans I thought I hadn't opened was empty and crushed behind a tree 20 feet out. There was never any damage. No breaking in.
No confrontation.
Just signs. Like someone was walking up while I slept and testing how close they could get. One night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright, staring at the door. Around 3 a.m., Clyde let out a sharp growl. Deep. I stood up slow, picked up the shotgun, and eased toward the door. I didn't open it. I waited. There was breathing. On the other side, I swear to God, heavy, slow breathing, right up against the wood. Then a sound like knuckles dragging across the door. 5 slow lines. I chambered a shell and backed away from the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. The breathing stopped. That was the last night I stayed there. In the morning, I loaded everything back into the truck, took down the solar light, packed the tools. I didn't say anything out loud, not even to Clyde. Before I left, I walked around the back of the cabin one last time. There, in the mud, was something new. A pile of dead squirrels. 7 of them, all laid in a perfect circle. Their eyes were missing. I didn't touch them. I didn't take a picture. I just got in the truck and drove out of the woods. I don't talk about it much. I told myself it was probably a sick person, maybe a survivalist with mental problems. But the way they moved, how they never got caught, how they left no tracks in or out, it didn't sit right. I never went back to check on the cabin. I don't even know if it's still standing. Sometimes, late at night, I remember the sound of the breathing through the wall and wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I don't think I want to know. Now I live near Spokane in a small 1-bedroom apartment. I still do construction, but only in the city. I don't go into the woods anymore. I sold the truck. Clyde's still with me. He's older now, slower, but he still tenses up when it rains, just like I do. And sometimes, when I wake up in the dark and the wind rattles the windows, I swear I can hear footsteps in the hall, but I know it's just my mind. At least I hope it is. My name is Ethan Ridley. Back in 2014, I was 31 years old and working as a seasonal park ranger at Cumberland Ridge State Park in northern Arkansas. It was a big, forested stretch of protected land. Over 20,000 acres of steep trails, old-growth pines, and backcountry that stretched out farther than most people realized. During the spring and summer, our ranger team was larger and more active, but by the time October rolled around, the staffing dropped down to a skeleton crew. That year, I volunteered to stay a few weeks into November to help shut down the back trails and keep an eye on weather damage before winter. There was a small outpost cabin about 9 miles in from the main road, used by rangers who worked the far trails. It had no power, just a wood stove, some old canned goods, a pump well, and a radio system hooked up to a tall antenna on a nearby ridge. I'd stayed in it before, and while it was a bit rough, I didn't mind. I brought some firewood, freeze-dried meals, and a sleeping bag. I had my own small solar charger for my flashlight and GPS unit. The idea was simple. Stay out there for 5 nights, hike in every day, mark down fallen trees or washouts, and call in anything major. I signed a log with the front office, gave them a schedule, and hiked out there alone. The air felt different that week. Cold, dry, too quiet. Even for deep forest, it was like everything had stepped back. No bird calls, barely any squirrels, just wind pushing through pine branches and the occasional crack of a falling twig. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the animals were sensing an early winter coming in, but it made me feel like I had to stay alert. That's a strange feeling when you're supposed to be somewhere peaceful. The first day went normal. I hiked the Ridgeback Trail west of the cabin and noted 3 downed trees and some heavy rutting from rain runoff. Got back before sunset, cooked some rice and beans, and read a little bit of an old paperback. I was in my sleeping bag by 9 p.m. The wind outside howled hard against the cabin that night, rattling the loose metal stovepipe and making the trees moan. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, not a bear thudding or a fox pacing outside. Human ones, crunching leaves, careful, light, too light, like someone was trying not to be heard. I froze in my bag and listened harder. Whoever it was, they stopped by the side window just out of my view. I had the shutter closed, but there were small gaps in the wood. I didn't see anything. I didn't even breathe for what felt like a whole minute. Then the footsteps walked around toward the back. I grabbed the small axe I kept next to the door and waited in the dark. I didn't move. I didn't turn on my flashlight. If this was someone from the park, they'd have radioed in. No one was scheduled to be up here but me. No vehicles were allowed up the Ridgeback Fire Road without a key, and I had the only spare. The main access trail crossed a riverbed with no bridge. It would have taken hours to hike in, and in the dark, too. No way. After 10 minutes, I opened the door and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. Just pine needles, cold wind, and fog rolling low along the ground like smoke. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter around the cabin looking for footprints. I didn't see any. The leaves were dry enough that they should have shown some trace of someone moving through them. But there was nothing but squirrel tracks and a few deer prints. I started thinking maybe I imagined it, that maybe I was overtired or stirred awake by the wind. But it had felt so specific, too real. I did my patrol anyway, hiked east along the Ridgeback Loop and checked the markers. Everything was fine, but the woods felt tighter that day. I kept catching faint movement in the corners of my vision, little things like shadows shifting or bark peeling, and every now and then I thought I heard a branch snap behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. That night, I triple-checked the lock on the door. I even wedged a wooden block under the knob and propped a folding chair under it. It wouldn't stop someone from kicking the door in, but it would buy me time if someone tried to enter quietly. I kept the axe closer this time and laid my GPS unit next to me. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something again. Not footsteps this time. A sound like fabric dragging across the outer wall, like someone brushing against it. The noise circled the cabin. Once, twice, then it stopped. I didn't go outside that night. Day 3, I found a set of strange marks out behind the cabin. They looked like heel prints, but barefoot, human. They started about 10 feet from the cabin and led into the trees. The prints were spaced too far apart for a casual walk, like someone was running, barefoot, away from the cabin. I followed them maybe 30 yards before they disappeared into pine needles. I didn't like it, not at all. I radioed the main office and asked if any hikers were reported missing. They said no. They asked if I needed pickup. I told them I was fine. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it, but I wasn't fine. That day on the trail, I started to feel like I was being followed. I'd stop and stand still, listening. Nothing. Then, when I'd start walking again, I'd hear faint footfalls behind me, delayed, slow, like someone was staying just out of sight. But every time I looked back, the woods were empty. When I got back that evening, I noticed something that made my chest lock up. The logbook I kept on the small table inside the cabin was open. I always kept it closed. Always. Not only that, it had writing in it. On a blank page near the back. It said, "Stop looking," that was all. No name, no date, just those 2 words in sloppy, almost shaky handwriting. Like someone wrote it fast. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't know if someone had gotten in while I was gone or if they were already in the cabin, hiding. The place wasn't that big, just one room, a narrow loft overhead, a crawl space below. I checked everything. I even pulled the old planks loose from the crawl space hatch and looked underneath. Nothing. I didn't sleep that night either. At dawn, I made the call. I radioed the front office again and said I wanted to be picked up. They told me to hike out to the upper fire road and they'd meet me there by noon. It was a 6-mile walk and I didn't waste time. I packed my bag, grabbed my gear, and left the cabin by 7 a.m. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I just kept moving. About halfway down the trail, I passed a side path we rarely used, an old logging cut that led deeper into the backcountry. Something was pinned to one of the trees. It was a photo, an actual printed photograph, nailed flat to the bark with a rusted tack. It showed the cabin, taken from outside. Through the side window, you could see me inside, asleep in my sleeping bag. The photo had to have been taken from just a few feet away from the glass. I didn't even look around. I didn't yell. I just started walking faster. My legs were shaking. I had pepper spray in one pocket and the axe strapped to my side. I kept one hand on both the whole way down the trail. When I reached the road, the truck wasn't there yet. So I waited. I kept my back against a tree and my eyes on the trail I'd come from. And about 5 minutes before the ranger truck arrived, I saw movement behind the trees. A man, tall, shirtless, dirty jeans, no shoes, thin, bony arms. He just stood there, half covered behind a tree, watching me. His face looked strange, either dirty or burned. Couldn't tell. His eyes never blinked. When the truck pulled up behind me, I turned to wave. When I looked back again, the man was gone. I didn't say much to the other ranger, just told them I'd felt off and saw a few things that didn't sit right with me. They nodded like they'd heard that kind of thing before. They didn't ask questions. I left the next day and didn't return to that park again. 3 weeks later, I got a call from one of the other rangers, Jules, a woman I used to work with. She asked if I remembered that old logging path I passed. I told her yes. Apparently, a hunting party had wandered up that way and found what looked like a handmade shelter built out of tree branches and a plastic tarp. There were bones inside. Not human, but deer and raccoons. and trash, old wrappers, cans, bits of clothing, even a rusted-out camera. They didn't find the man, but they found more photos, dozens, all of the same cabin, all taken at different times of day and night, from every angle, some even older, showing rangers from before my time. No one knows who he was, or how long he'd been living out there, but I still think about that night, about the sound of footsteps, about the writing in the logbook, about the photo of me asleep. And I know, deep down, that he'd been watching me the whole time. It was the spring of 2019 when I decided to take a long break from everything. I was 34 years old then, and after working 12 years straight in the same dull IT job in Kansas City, I was burned out. My mind felt foggy, my chest tight most mornings, and I'd started getting headaches that stuck around for days. I didn't want pills or therapy. I just wanted to get away from people, screens, and constant noise. A coworker of mine had mentioned a secluded cabin he used to visit near Copper Ridge in Wyoming. It wasn't on any rental site. It had no cell service, no plumbing, no power. Just an old wooden shack with a stovepipe and a mattress. He hadn't been there in years. Said it belonged to his cousin who didn't mind if someone used it now and then. When I asked him for directions, he scribbled them on the back of a faded receipt and handed it to me like it was nothing. I packed light: a cot, my sleeping bag, a hatchet, a big cooler full of non-perishables, a camp stove, a lantern, spare batteries, my knife, and a can of bear spray. I wasn't going for fun. I wanted quiet and stillness. I left my phone in the glove box of my truck when I parked it near a dirt pull-off off Highway 14. The trail to the cabin wasn't marked. I followed a set of tire ruts barely visible in the grass and dirt, crossing a shallow creek and climbing for about an hour up the side of the ridge. The air got thinner as the sun dropped lower behind the trees. Just as the light was starting to fade, I spotted the edge of the roof. It looked like it had been dropped there from the sky. Nothing but scrub, trees, and silence all around it. The cabin was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a tiny porch that leaned slightly to one side. The wood was gray from sun and snow, and there were rusty nails sticking out in places. The door was old, but it held. Inside, the air was musty and cold, even though the evening was warm outside. Dust lay thick over everything. There was an old table against one wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner with a stack of chopped logs beside it, and a single window looking out to the trees. I didn't see anything that looked dangerous or broken. It was just old, forgotten, perfect. I settled in quickly, made a small fire in the stove, laid out my sleeping bag on the cot, and warmed up a can of chili. I didn't do much that first night, just sat on the porch with a light breeze brushing through the tall grass, listening to the wind. There was no traffic noise, no buzz of electricity, no voices. It was what I needed. I fell asleep early and slept harder than I had in months. The second day, I woke up early and went for a walk around the cabin area. There was an old deer trail to the east that curved up into a thicker patch of trees. I followed it for a while and found a small clearing with signs of an old fire pit, long cold. Maybe hunters had camped there once. I didn't think much of it. Back at the cabin, I chopped some more wood from the small pile of dead trees behind the place and restocked the inside log bin. The day passed quietly. It wasn't until the third night that I noticed the sound. I had turned in early again. No phone, no books, just the dim glow of the lantern, then darkness. I was almost asleep when I heard something outside. It was faint, like dry leaves being stepped on, very slow and steady. I opened my eyes and listened, holding my breath. For a moment, it stopped. I sat up and waited. Then I heard it again, maybe 10 seconds later, closer this time. A slow, shuffling step, then silence, then another. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. could even be the wind pushing something over. I didn't want to panic. Still, I quietly got up and moved to the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there and listened. Whatever it was, it didn't make another sound for over a minute. Then I heard a soft thump on the porch. Just one. Then silence again. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I opened the door and looked around. The porch was empty, but there were faint scuff marks in the dirt just past the last step. No clear boot print or animal track, just smudges, like someone had dragged their foot. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking the trees, the tall grass, the small clearing to the north. Nothing. It was like it never happened. Still, I couldn't shake it. That day, I carried the bear spray on my hip even while chopping wood. I kept glancing toward the trees every few minutes. The silence now felt heavier, not peaceful anymore, like it was waiting. That night, it started again. Same thing. Just as I was falling asleep, I heard a step, then another, slow, measured. I grabbed the lantern, lit it, and stood by the door. Nothing. Then a faint knock. Not on the door, on the wall, right behind where the cot was. A single knock, like someone was standing inches away. I held my breath and didn't move. The knock didn't come again. I stayed standing for an hour, lantern flickering, listening, but there was only silence. In the morning, I went outside and checked every inch of the wall behind the cot. Again, no marks, nothing disturbed. But the dirt near that side of the cabin looked a little different, like it had been pressed down. Again, no boot prints, just soft indentations. It was hard to say. By now, the peace I had come for was long gone. I was tense, jumpy. I didn't feel like eating. I felt watched. I told myself I'd stay one more night. Then I'd hike back down and head home. I could say I gave it a shot. That evening, I packed everything except the sleeping bag and the stove gear. I left my food cooler outside in case a bear came by, though I doubted anything wild would come this close with something else already around. I couldn't say what it was yet, just that something was wrong. The last night was worse than the others. I barely let the lantern go out. I sat up in the cot, wide awake, and waited. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. A step outside. Not a stumble or shuffle this time. Clean, clear step. Then another. The porch creaked just once. Then a pause. The door handle moved. Not much, just a small jiggle. Then another. Then silence. I stood up slowly, holding my knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other. I didn't move to the door. I just stood in the dark. My heart was thudding hard in my chest. The handle stopped moving. Then came a sound that made every hair on my neck stand up. The window latch creaked. The window was on the back wall, not the door side. I spun toward it, holding the lantern up. Nothing was visible. I stepped closer. The latch was still closed, but now I was sure. Someone was trying to get in. Slowly, quietly, patiently. I didn't sleep. I sat in the center of the room until dawn, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other, listening. There were no more sounds. Nothing. The next morning, I stepped outside into the cold air. The sky was gray, windless. I walked around the cabin one more time. That's when I found it. Just past the tree line to the south, a small camouflage tarp hidden under branches. Under it, a few empty water bottles, some protein bar wrappers, and an old, tattered sleeping bag. Someone had been staying there, watching, maybe waiting for me to leave, maybe waiting for something else. I didn't touch anything. I didn't make a sound. I turned around, walked back to the cabin, packed the rest of my gear, and left. I didn't stop once going back down the trail. When I got to my truck, I got in and locked the doors. The whole drive back to Kansas City, I kept checking the mirrors. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't want to hear their guesses or jokes. But I called my coworker a few weeks later and told him about the tarp and the sleeping bag. He just got quiet, said he had no idea anyone had been out there, but I could tell he was shaken too. I never went back. I never will. Looking back now, I don't think whoever was out there wanted to hurt me right away. I think they were watching to see how long I'd stay. Maybe they were trying to scare me off, or maybe they were just waiting for the right moment. What scares me most is knowing that if I had stayed one more night, or opened the door that first time I heard the knocking, I might not have walked back down that ridge. I was 26 that fall, living in Des Moines and doing delivery work part-time while saving for something better. I wasn't doing great, just making enough to pay rent and eat. It wasn't bad either, just quiet. That's why I didn't think twice when my old high school friend Carter called me out of the blue and said he needed help clearing out his late uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Minnesota. I hadn't seen Carter since his wedding 2 years back, and even though we were never best friends, I figured why not. It would be a weekend away from the city, free food, and maybe a couple nights of peace in the woods. Carter's uncle had died that summer. I didn't know much about him, just that he was a quiet man, used to work in logging, never had kids. Carter said he had been living alone out there for nearly 15 years after retiring, only coming into town once every few months for supplies. He died in his sleep, apparently. Nothing strange about that, just old age. We drove up in his truck on a Thursday morning in late October. The trees were mostly bare by then, orange and brown leaves crunching under the tires. He kept the heat on high, and we passed time listening to AM radio and trading stories. The road turned to gravel about an hour after we passed Grand Rapids. After that, it was a long stretch of dirt and pine, not a lot of cell reception, and not another soul in sight. By the time we reached the cabin, the sky was already dimming. I hadn't expected it to be that remote. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of roads or other homes for miles. The air was still and cold. The place sat on a small rise next to a frozen pond, completely surrounded by dense spruce and jack pine. It wasn't falling apart, but it looked like no one had touched it since the uncle died. A tarp was draped over a pile of firewood, and a rusty old generator sat near the side of the house. One window was boarded up. We unpacked the truck and started a fire in the old stone fireplace inside. The cabin was small, just one big room with a cot, a wood stove, a couple shelves, and a table in the center. The kitchen had a propane stove and a hand pump for water. Carter only planned to stay 2 nights. He said we'd just go through the place, box up anything important, and take pictures for the lawyer handling the estate. I didn't mind. It was quiet out there, and something about it made me feel like I was further away from everything than I'd ever been. The first night passed easy. We ate canned stew, drank cheap beer, and went through a couple of the storage boxes stacked near the wall. They were full of old tools, deer antlers, and faded hunting licenses going back to the 80s. I slept in a sleeping bag on the floor while Carter took the cot. The next morning, we split up chores. Carter worked on sorting some junk in the shed while I stayed inside, cleaning out the pantry and cupboards. I came across a strange smell coming from behind the shelf near the back. It wasn't strong, but it was there. Musty, old meat maybe, but very faint. I ignored it. That afternoon, Carter said he had to leave early. Something about his wife needing the truck. He asked if I'd be all right staying the night alone and said he'd be back by noon the next day. I told him it was fine. I didn't really mind being alone out there. I even kind of looked forward to it. After he left, the cabin felt bigger somehow. The silence grew heavier. Not uncomfortable, just more noticeable. I spent the evening walking the edge of the woods, trying to get a signal on my phone. Nothing. Then I sat outside and watched the sky turn dark. The generator coughed once when I started it, but it ran fine. I used the light inside to read through some of the old hunting journals the uncle had kept. There were stacks of them in the corner, full of weather notes, trap logs, and little comments about tracks or how many birds he'd seen. It was peaceful stuff, nothing unusual, but it was detailed. Then I found the last notebook. It was newer, the only one not dusty. The entries in it were different too. They weren't about deer or snow levels. They were shorter, messier, and not dated properly. Some of them just said things like, "Heard the noise again last night," or asterisk, "Someone was on the ridge." Asterisk, there were pages crossed out violently with thick pen strokes. One of them had a sketch of what looked like the outline of the cabin, with tiny X's drawn in the trees around it. Another just read, asterisk, "I don't sleep much anymore." Asterisk, that was the first time I felt truly uneasy. Still, I figured maybe the old man was just losing it. He was isolated for years. Cabin fever, maybe. I closed the book, set it aside, and got ready for bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to snap me out of sleep. I lay still, listening. It was a soft crunching, like footsteps in the snow. I stayed quiet. The fire had died down. The generator hummed low outside, but this noise was separate. It circled the cabin. Once, then again. I sat up in my bag and looked at the window, but I couldn't see much. No movement. The sound stopped. I stayed awake until almost dawn, not moving. Eventually, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the sunlight was leaking in through the boards. I went outside immediately. There were footprints. They weren't boots. They weren't even shoes. Bare feet. Human. They circled the cabin twice and vanished into the trees. I stood out there in the cold, staring at them. They were fresh. The frost was still crisp around the edges. I followed them a few yards into the woods, but they faded fast in the underbrush. That was when I really started to feel it, that tight, wrong feeling in my gut. I went back in, locked the door, and sat near the fire for a while. I kept trying to reason with myself. Maybe someone was living off-grid nearby. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe they were old prints that thawed weird. I told myself anything that sounded halfway logical. But by late morning, Carter still wasn't back. No calls.
No texts.
Nothing. I told myself he was just late. But that feeling wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to fold anything. I loaded everything into the small ATV parked behind the shed. Carter had shown me how to start it the day before in case I wanted to ride down to the stream. It wasn't ideal for driving all the way out, but I was planning to take it back to the main road and hitch a ride if needed. As I started the engine, I heard a noise behind me, a branch cracking. I turned fast, but saw nothing. Still, I didn't wait. I took off down the path, the wheels bouncing hard over the rocks and frozen dirt. I didn't stop, not even when I hit a rut that nearly knocked me off. I drove that thing until I found the gravel road and followed it until I finally got reception again. I called Carter, straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. Eventually, I flagged down a passing pickup, and the driver dropped me off at a gas station outside Grand Rapids. I waited there for hours. Carter never showed. The next day, I called the police and gave them everything. I told them where the cabin was, that Carter was supposed to meet me, and that something felt off. They went up that afternoon, but the cabin was empty. No sign of Carter. No sign of any other footprints. Nothing but mine. They said the ATV was there, parked neatly beside the shed like I never left. The boxes we packed were still inside. Even the journal was gone. They searched the woods for 2 days. Never found him. They asked if maybe Carter never actually came with me. If maybe I'd gone up there alone and something had happened. I told them to call his wife. She confirmed he had planned the trip. Said he packed and left like normal. But something didn't add up. A few weeks later, the lawyer in charge of the estate called me. Said there was no record of Carter's uncle owning any cabin. No property in his name in Minnesota. I still don't understand it, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I remember those footprints in the frost. Bare, human, and quiet as death. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't care how peaceful they seem, because something out there watches, and it doesn't want to be found. It was the fall of 2022 when my ex-wife, Maggie, passed away. We'd been divorced for 6 years by then. I was 43, working construction in a small town outside of Missoula, Montana. Maggie stayed in Idaho after the divorce, in a small wooden cabin near Lake Coeur d'Alene. I never expected to go back to that place, not after everything we'd been through. But when her sister called me and told me Maggie had died in her sleep, some kind of aneurysm, it all came back. Not just the memories, but the house itself, the trees, the dirt road leading up to the front steps. She didn't leave much behind. No will, no next of kin other than a few scattered family members. And she'd kept the cabin in her name. Somehow, maybe out of guilt or some strange leftover connection, I agreed to go down and pack up her things. It was early November when I made the trip. The drive down from Missoula to Coeur d'Alene was long, cold, and gray, the kind of quiet that sits heavy on your chest. I had my old F-150 packed with a few duffel bags, a cooler, and some boxes. I figured I'd spend 2 nights there, clean the place out, maybe find someone local to handle the sale. The moment I turned off the highway and started down the long dirt road toward her cabin, something shifted in me. I hadn't been down that road in over a decade, and the trees still leaned in over the path the same way. The leaves had already turned and dropped, so the forest was filled with that dull rustling sound of dead things moving in the wind. It was just before dark when I pulled up in front of the cabin. The sky was orange and purple through the trees. The place looked mostly the same, small, one-story, slanted tin roof, porch sagging slightly on the left side. I shut the truck off and sat for a minute. The air was cold enough that my breath fogged up the windshield. I didn't want to go in, not really, but I couldn't just sit out there all night. When I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked the same way it always had. I took the key from under the flower pot where Maggie always kept it and let myself in. It smelled like stale air and old wood. There was no heating system, just a wood-burning stove in the corner. The furniture was simple. A couch with a few throw blankets, an armchair that used to be mine, and a small table in the kitchen area with 2 mismatched chairs. Dust floated in the air like tiny snowflakes. I didn't start unpacking that night. I lit a fire in the stove, made a sandwich from the cooler in the truck, and sat in the armchair wrapped in a blanket. There was no cell service. I kept trying to check messages, maybe distract myself, but there was nothing. I couldn't stop thinking about Maggie. We hadn't talked in years. We ended bad, arguing, pushing each other away, never really forgiving anything. I wondered if she'd ever thought of calling me before she passed. I wondered if she knew she was dying. That night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I had trouble sleeping, not because of fear, but because the place felt like time had stopped inside it. Nothing had moved in that house for weeks, maybe months. I slept on the couch with my boots on, the fire dying down sometime around 3 in the morning. The next day, I started sorting through her things. The bedroom was still as I remembered it. Same quilt, same lamp on the nightstand. Her clothes were still in the closet, hung up like she was coming back. Most of it was women's stuff, but in one drawer I found a stack of old photos. Us from years ago. Some from when we went camping in Glacier, others from the first year we moved into this cabin. I sat on the bed and looked through them for a long time. There was a photo of me holding a trout, grinning like an idiot. She took that picture. Behind me in the photo was the lake, glistening through the trees. I didn't know what to do with the photos, so I put them in my duffel. Around noon, I went outside and walked around the property. The trees around the back of the cabin had grown thicker. I noticed something odd near the edge of the woods, an old shovel leaning against a tree. The handle was cracked, but the blade had been used recently. The dirt nearby was disturbed, like something had been dug up. Not a big hole, maybe a foot wide. I crouched down and touched the soil. It was cold and loose. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she'd tried to plant something before winter hit. Maybe some animal had dug through it. Inside, I kept packing. Kitchen stuff, books, clothes. That evening, I went to grab a beer from the cooler and realized something strange. My wallet, which I was sure I had left on the counter, was now sitting on the floor beside the couch. I figured maybe I dropped it. No big deal. That night, I brought in more firewood and kept the stove going. The wind picked up. You could hear it in the trees, brushing against the side of the cabin. I sat in the armchair again, reading one of her old books, something about gardening. Around midnight, I thought I heard something out back, like a stick cracking. I stood up, turned off the lamp, and stared through the window into the dark. Nothing, just the black silhouettes of trees swaying. I told myself it was just a branch falling or an animal moving through the woods, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, hearing soft thuds on the porch. Once I thought I heard the doorknob move, but when I checked, it was locked. Still, I took the axe from the firewood pile and laid it beside me on the couch. The next morning, I felt off. My stomach was tight, my head hurt. I stepped outside for air, and right away, I noticed the shovel was gone. The dirt near the woods looked even more messed up now, like something had been covered up in a hurry. There were boot prints leading away from it, but they looked old. Still, I didn't remember seeing them the day before. I walked toward the tree line and looked around. Nothing else seemed out of place. Back inside, I sat down and tried to think. I felt watched, like something was just out of sight. I decided to finish packing that day and leave early. I was supposed to stay 2 nights, but I didn't want to sleep there again, not with how strange everything felt. By afternoon, I had most of the cabin boxed up. I took one last walk through each room, just making sure I hadn't missed anything. That's when I noticed it, the crawl space under the cabin. There was a small wooden door beside the kitchen pantry. I hadn't thought about it in years. I grabbed the flashlight from my truck and pulled the handle. Creaked open. The smell hit me first. Damp earth and something else. Not rot exactly. More like mildew and old animal hair. I crouched down and shined the light inside. There wasn't much space. Just a few feet of clearance and wooden beams holding up the floor. But something glinted near the far wall. I crawled in. It was a metal box. I dragged it out and opened it. Inside were several notebooks, Maggie's handwriting. I flipped through one, and my stomach turned. They were journals, not just about her gardening or her health, but about someone she thought was watching her. Paranoia. She wrote about footsteps outside the cabin at night, food going missing, seeing movement in the woods. She even mentioned waking up once and finding the front door unlocked when she knew she had locked it. In the last notebook, she wrote about finding someone's boot prints outside her window. She thought someone had been sneaking around the cabin. The final entry was short. Saw him again. Same jacket. Same way he stands. I think he wants something. Maybe I should confront him. That was dated October 3rd. She died on October 6th. My skin went cold. I put the journals in my bag and sealed the box again. I backed out of the crawl space and locked the door behind me. I decided to leave right then. I loaded up the truck, made one last sweep through the house, and grabbed the keys. As I was walking out, I noticed something near the side of the porch. A crushed cigarette butt. Maggie didn't smoke. I hadn't smoked since 2018. Someone else had been there recently. I got in the truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. The dirt road was even narrower in the dark. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But it was just trees, branches, and darkness. Back in Missoula, I gave the journals to the local sheriff's office. I didn't know what else to do. I told them everything about the shovel, the disturbed ground, the cigarette. They took a statement and said they'd reach out to Idaho authorities. A week later, someone called to say they investigated the property. They found signs of recent digging, but no body, no evidence of foul play. They chalked Maggie's notes up to mental health issues. I didn't push it, but I didn't believe it, not really. I still don't. It's been 3 years now. I live in a different town, further east, near Billings. I don't go into the woods much anymore. Sometimes I dream about that cabin, about hearing steps on the porch or finding more cigarette butts. But I know I'll never go back there, not for any reason. Something happened to her out there. I don't know what, but I know she wasn't just imagining things. She was being watched, maybe for months, and I think whoever it was might still be watching someone else now. I was 34 when I decided to take a week off in October and head up into the forests of northern Idaho. I had been working nonstop for 2 years as a property surveyor for a private firm in Spokane. Between contracts, I rarely had time to myself. My back hurt. My eyes were always dry from squinting at blueprints. I needed to be alone for a while, and hunting always brought me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. I picked a spot near the Clearwater National Forest, about 2 hours away from the nearest real town. I knew of a small wooden cabin up there, one that used to belong to a guy I knew back in college, Eddie McCullough. He had passed away in a car accident a few years back, and his family didn't seem interested in keeping the place. The property was technically still under their name, but no one was using it. They didn't mind if someone went up there now and then. Eddie once told me the cabin had been in his family for generations and that his grandfather built it in the 1950s. It wasn't on any main road. No signs led to it. It sat off an old fire access trail, hidden in a tight bend of pine and fir trees. I packed my truck with the usual things, my Remington 700, a cooler full of meat and snacks, some bottled water, a hunting license, a GPS device, spare batteries, a compass, and 2 boxes of ammo. I also brought my sleeping bag, a propane heater, and an old hunting journal I hadn't used in over a decade. I left Spokane around 6 a.m. on a Monday morning. The sun hadn't fully come up yet, and the sky was painted in gray and purple streaks. I drove with the window cracked open, letting the cold air keep me awake. It took 4 hours to reach the turnoff, then another 40 minutes down the narrow dirt trail to get to the base of the hill where the cabin was. I had to hike the last half mile on foot since the path was too rough for the truck. The forest was quiet and still. Not a single car had passed me once I left the highway. When I reached the cabin, everything was exactly how I remembered it. The roof sagged a bit more. The wood was darker and more worn, but it still stood strong. It was a single-room structure, no power, no plumbing. Just an outhouse out back, a rusty wood stove inside, and a table with a bench. There were old hunting magazines on the shelf and some cracked mugs. A cot in the corner with a rolled-up wool blanket. I set my things down and stepped back outside, taking a long breath of the cold pine-scented air. That first day, I didn't do much. I checked my gear, cleaned the rifle, and walked a short loop around the property. I saw fresh deer tracks in the mud about 100 yards behind the cabin, near a dried-up creek bed. I made note of it in my journal. That night, I sat on the porch with a beer in hand and watched the sky go black. There were no sounds except the wind and a few creaking trees. I slept surprisingly well. The second day, I went hunting early. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, about 3 miles out, and stayed low along the ridge. I didn't see anything except a few squirrels and a single coyote in the distance. No shots fired. I came back by early afternoon, warmed up some Kenchili on the propane burner, and read an old article in one of the magazines about bear tracking. Around dusk, I heard a branch snap out near the tree line. I froze, listening. Nothing followed it. Could have been anything, but it put me a little on edge. I didn't think much of it the next morning. I told myself I was just out of practice. I spent too long in cities. My instincts weren't as sharp anymore. I geared up again and headed out, this time further west of the creek bed. I found a good spot beneath a rock outcrop and waited. I sat for hours. At one point I heard movement, heavy movement, like footsteps crunching dried leaves behind me. I turned quick and raised the rifle, but nothing was there.
No deer, no elk.
Just trees. That night was colder. I left the heater on low and bundled up. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was soft but sharp, like metal scraping on wood. I thought maybe the wind had knocked something loose outside. I got up, put on my boots and coat, and stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. I walked around the side of the cabin, shining the light along the wall. The old axe that had been leaning against the porch rail was gone. That made my stomach drop. I looked around the ground but didn't see it nearby. I figured maybe it fell and rolled under the porch or something. I didn't want to assume anything worse. I went back inside and sat up for a few hours, just listening. No more sounds came. At sunrise, I went back out and looked again. Still no axe. That third day, I didn't go hunting. I stayed close, circled the cabin's perimeter several times, trying to settle myself. Around noon, I saw faint tracks I hadn't made. A few boot prints coming in from the east along the tree line, then looping behind the cabin and vanishing again. They weren't deep. Whoever made them hadn't been running, just walking. The tread pattern didn't match mine. I didn't know what to do. It was too far from town to just drive out for help over footprints. And it wasn't illegal for someone else to be in the woods. Maybe it was another hunter, but I hadn't seen anyone in 3 days. No tire tracks, no smoke from other camps. It didn't sit right with me. I spent that evening sitting on the porch with my rifle in my lap, the safety on, just watching the trees. Nothing moved. When it got dark, I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed the table in front of it. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the missing axe. On the fourth day, I woke up before dawn and started packing. I decided I'd had enough. I told myself I wasn't scared, just tired and irritated. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong. I stuffed everything into my duffel, but when I went to open the cabin door, it wouldn't budge. The latch was stuck. I tried again, harder, and the whole thing rattled like it had been jammed from the outside. I looked out the front window. There was wire wrapped around the door handle. Tight, rusted barbed wire, strung through the porch railing and twisted into a knot. My stomach dropped. I hadn't brought any wire like that. I didn't even own any. I ran to the back window and looked out. The woods were still, silent. I grabbed a hunting knife from my bag and climbed out the side window, landing in the dirt. My boots crunched too loud in the stillness. I stayed low, crept around to the front, and saw the full mess. The axe was back, but it was sunk into the porch post, buried in the wood right next to the door. The wire was real. Whoever did this had been here again, probably while I was sleeping. I didn't think. I just ran. I grabbed my bag and rifle, didn't even lock the cabin, and jogged straight for the trail that led back to my truck. I didn't care about the rest of my stuff. I just wanted to be out of there.
I gick fast.
The GPS said I was close to the truck when I started hearing it. Footsteps again. Behind me, not close, not running, but steady. I turned once, saw nothing, kept moving. I never broke into a run, just moved fast and kept looking over my shoulder. When I reached the truck, everything looked normal at first. But when I opened the door, I saw that the inside had been torn up. The seat cushions were ripped open, glove box emptied. The map I had taped to the dash was missing. The keys were still under the floor mat where I always kept them, and the engine turned over fine, but the battery meter was lower than it should have been. Someone had been inside. I drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Then I pulled over and threw up on the side of the highway. I sat there for 15 minutes, just breathing, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone. Not for months. When I finally did talk to someone, a ranger I met at a bar in Lewiston, he just nodded slowly and said, "There's some people that go deep into those woods who don't want to be found." That's all he said. That was enough. I never went back to the cabin. I left all my old gear there. I started hunting closer to home on private land, places where I knew the neighbors. And I never sleep without locking every door and checking every window twice. Sometimes at night, I still hear that soft metal scraping in my head. Not because it's still happening, but because I can't forget the moment I realized I wasn't alone out there. And whoever was out there, they knew exactly where I was sleeping. It was late October 2019 when I took a trip up to northern Maine by myself. I was 34 years old at the time, had recently gone through a bad breakup, and I was just tired of the city. I wanted to get away. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't even tell many people I was going. I left my apartment in Portland at dawn, drove for nearly 6 hours, and ended up deep in an area just outside of a town called Millinocket. I'd been looking at maps for weeks, marking trails and back roads that weren't well traveled. I wasn't after some social campsite with bathrooms and fire pits. I wanted real, empty woods, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one else cared about. I parked my truck off a gravel road that seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. I had to back up and reapproach a few times just to avoid bottoming out. Eventually, I found a small flat area where I could pull off and disappear behind the trees. The forest around me was thick and damp. Pine needles layered the ground, and the trees leaned in like they'd been left to their own growth for generations. My plan was simple. I'd hike in about 4 or 5 miles to a spot I'd found on satellite view. It was near a bend in an old logging trail that had overgrown long ago. I figured if I got there by late afternoon, I could set up my tent, make some food, and just sit in silence.
No phones.
No cars, just cold air and dead leaves. I hiked for what felt like forever. My pack was heavier than I'd tested it for, but I kept pushing through. The trees grew tighter as I moved further off the visible path. About an hour in, the wind started picking up. It wasn't strong, just enough to rattle the dry branches and send a few loose leaves tumbling along the ground like they were alive. By the time I got to the spot I marked, it was maybe 4 p.m., and the light had already started to soften. I found the edge of the logging trail, barely visible under moss and weeds. It was like the woods had swallowed it whole. I stood there for a bit, just breathing. Everything around me was still, too still. No barges, no ski house, no wind anymore, just quiet. I was just about to start clearing a space for the tent when I saw something further down the trail. It looked like a corner of something square. At first, I thought it was a rock or a weird stump, but it had edges, man-made edges. I set my pack down and walked towards it. It only took a minute to see what it really was. A cabin. It sat about 20 feet off the old trail, surrounded by trees that had grown close enough to scratch at the walls. The wood siding was gray and rotten, curled at the ends like old bark. The roof was sagging in the middle, the metal patches rusted and loose. One window in front had no glass at all, just a black square with rotted trim. The door hung slightly open, maybe a foot, enough to see that the inside was darker than the woods around it. I stood there staring at it. I wasn't expecting to find anything out here. I had looked through as many maps and property records as I could. Nothing showed up in this area, and that trail wasn't even listed on any public hiking guide. I was curious, though. I had no reason not to look, so I walked up slowly. The steps were gone, just a few broken boards sticking up from the dirt. I put one foot on the threshold and leaned in. The smell hit first: rot, mold, something else like wet dog and rust. I pushed the door open with my boot and stepped inside. It was one big room. The floor was warped and splintered, like it had been soaked and dried 100 times. On the left was a small wood stove, rusted and blackened. A chair with a broken leg lay on its side. To the right was a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, one still upright. Everything was covered in dust, and not just dust, but a fine powder like wood ash or plaster. There were shelves nailed into the wall, mostly empty, but a few rusted cans were still sitting there. Some had labels, faded so bad I could only make out shapes. One of them looked like it used to be beans. The window in the back had been covered with what looked like an old mattress frame, nailed in across the opening like a makeshift grate. I didn't go in too far, just looked around from the doorway and a few careful steps. The air felt thick, not in a supernatural way or anything, just damp, heavy, wrong. I backed out and went back to where I dropped my pack. I stood there for a while thinking. I didn't want to sleep near it, but I was too tired to hike another hour. I moved maybe 100 yards away and set up my tent in a small hollow beneath a cluster of spruce trees. The light faded fast, and by the time I was eating dinner, just a cold wrap and trail mix, the sky had turned dark blue. I tried not to think about the cabin, but it stayed in my head. I thought about who built it, why it was so far out here with no road or signs. I figured maybe it was an old hunting cabin, long abandoned. Maybe someone built it back in the 50s or 60s and never came back. But then I thought about how empty the inside felt, like someone had been there more recently, or at least tried to keep people out. That night I barely slept. It wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. No wind, no animals, just silence. Once, around 2 a.m., I heard a small snap, like a twig breaking, but I told myself it was a deer or a falling branch. I kept my knife in my hand most of the night, and I don't think I ever really drifted off. The next morning, I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to feel like I was scared off by some old building. I'd made this trip to get away, to push myself out of the soft comfort of home. So I decided I'd stay one more night, but I needed something to do. Sitting around all day would only make me more paranoid. So I went back to the cabin. This time I brought my flashlight, even though it was still morning. I pushed the door open all the way and stepped inside properly. The floor creaked under my boots. Dust floated in the air where the light hit through the broken window. In the back corner, past the table, I noticed a trapdoor. It was subtle, just a square cut into the floor, with a metal ring set into the wood. The edges were hidden under a dusty rug that had been kicked aside long ago. I don't know how I missed it the first time. Maybe I hadn't walked in that far. I stood over it, staring. Then I knelt and pulled. Stuck at first, but after a few tugs, it groaned open. Beneath it was a narrow wooden staircase. The light barely reached past the first few steps. It smelled worse down there. Wet soil, old metal, something sharp. I aimed my flashlight down and took a few careful steps. The boards groaned under my weight, but they held. The stairs went down maybe 10 feet. The basement wasn't tall. I had to crouch. The dirt floor was uneven and damp, and the walls were rough stone. There were shelves down there, wood ones, rotted and bent. Some jars, most empty. One still holding what looked like cloudy water and something floating. There was a workbench, too. Rusted tools lay scattered across it. Pliers, a hammer, a hacksaw. All worn, all real. What made me freeze was the chain. A long, heavy chain was bolted into the far wall. It had a shackle on the end, like the kind you'd see in old prison photos. It wasn't just thrown there, it was mounted, drilled into the stone with intent. That's when I felt something shift in my gut. I backed out slowly, step by step, flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the top, I slammed the trapdoor and kicked the rug back over it. I don't know why, like it made a difference. I left the cabin without looking back and didn't return. I sat by my tent most of the day, packed my gear slowly, and made sure everything was ready for the morning. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up in the dark, knife in hand, back against a tree. At around 3 a.m., I heard something move out there. It wasn't close, maybe 100 feet away, but it wasn't an animal. Sounded like boots. Slow. One step, pause. Another step, then nothing. I held my breath, didn't move, didn't blink. Minutes passed, then a creak. Not in the forest. A door. The cabin. Something had opened that door. I sat there frozen for what felt like hours. I never saw anyone, never heard anything after that. But I didn't sleep, not a second. As soon as the light changed, just a pale blue in the sky, I packed and left. I hiked fast, barely stopping for water, and made it back to my truck in under 3 hours. The drive back was quiet. I kept looking in the mirror, like I expected to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. I never went back, never reported it. I figured it had been forgotten for a reason. Whoever used that place, whatever happened down there, it wasn't my business. But sometimes I think about that shackle, and that sound of the door creaking open in the dark. I was 31 when I moved out to the cabin. It was late spring of 2018, and I had just quit a maintenance job in Eugene, Oregon. Too much noise, too many people. I needed space. The cabin had belonged to my uncle, who passed away a few years earlier. It was set on the far edge of an old farm property, way out in the northeastern part of Nebraska. It wasn't connected to anything anymore, really. The farming operations had stopped years ago. My uncle just kept the cabin for hunting and getting away from things. When he died, nobody wanted it. It was run down, too far from town, and there wasn't even cell reception unless you hiked up the hill on the west side of the land. I guess the land had value, but the cabin was more of a forgotten corner of the property. It passed to my dad, then to me when my dad got sick and downsized. I drove out in my old white Tacoma with the bed packed full, tools, coolers, one cot, a rusted steel toolbox, and a plastic bin full of cheap food from Walmart. It was a 2-day drive. I passed through flat highways and gas stations that looked abandoned even when they were open. The weather was cloudy the whole time, like the sky didn't want to be part of it. I remember thinking it felt like everything had just paused. The cabin was small, just one main room with a wood stove, a little table, a twin bed frame with a shredded mattress I didn't use, and an outhouse behind a dead row of trees. No running water, no power. It sat back behind a half-collapsed fence and a twisted cattle gate with one working hinge. On the walk up, grass scratched my jeans and bugs crawled out of every shadow. I got there around 5 in the evening. The sun was starting to go down, but it still felt like mid-afternoon because it was early summer and the sky stayed bright longer than you wanted it to. There was no wind, no traffic, just quiet that pressed against your skin like wet clothes. When I stepped inside the cabin, it smelled like dried animal droppings and old wood. Everything was covered in a soft coat of dust, like a layer of gray snow. I opened the small window to air it out, rolled out my cot, and set my water jug on the table. That first night, I cooked a can of beans on a little camp stove outside and sat on a broken chair behind the cabin to eat. The fields stretched out in every direction, flat and empty. You could see for miles, but there was nothing out there. Just dry weeds, a few rusted silos, and a leaning barn about 200 yards away that looked like it'd fall over if you leaned on it. I remember looking at it while I ate and thinking, that's where I'll store my tools. But I never went inside that barn. Not really. I tried, but something always stopped me. I'll get to that. That night I heard scratching. Not loud, just soft, irregular taps along the back wall of the cabin. I assumed it was raccoons or squirrels. The place hadn't been used in years. Animals probably took it over. I banged on the wall with my boot, and it stopped. I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up around midnight, and something metal banged out in the field, like a loose sheet of tin hitting a fence post over and over. But when I went out in the morning, there was nothing metal anywhere close by. Nothing loose, nothing hanging. I spent the next few days cleaning. I swept out the dirt, burned some of the trash in a fire pit, fixed the fence gate, and knocked down a wasp nest near the roof. I checked the attic too. It was just a crawl space, really, no ladder, just an opening in the ceiling that you could reach if you stood on the table. I poked my head up there and saw insulation that looked like chewed paper, some empty cans, a torn sleeping bag, and a boot. Just one boot. I didn't think much of it. The fields never changed.
No birds, no deer.
Just still, dry grass that rustled even when the wind was dead. I would go out each morning and walk the perimeter just to get my body moving. One day, on the third week, I found something strange out by the old barn. It was a pair of jeans, torn, soaked through like they'd been left out in the rain. But it hadn't rained in 2 weeks. They were folded, almost neatly, right next to the back wall of the barn, under a boarded window. I looked around, called out a few times, but of course there was no answer. No one around for miles. I took the jeans back to the cabin, planning to burn them or maybe just throw them out with the rest of the junk, but something about them bothered me. They were adult-sized, too big for a kid. They had a torn pocket and mud crusted into the knees, and they smelled like, not sweat, but something sourer, like mildew and skin. I left them on a stump outside. That night, I heard the scratching again, but louder. Not just taps, scrapes like nails or claws against dry wood. Then a sound like something heavy bumping the side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and went out the back door, shining the light along the walls and down into the brush. Nothing, but the jeans were gone. I looked around in the beam of the flashlight, but I didn't see tracks. The grass was flattened around the stump, but no clear direction. I walked a small loop around the area and came back to the cabin, heart beating a little faster now. I locked the door, which was just a deadbolt and a hook latch, and sat inside with my flashlight on until morning. After that, I started seeing signs that someone had been on the property. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. A can I left on the table was on the floor the next day. My hammer was outside, leaning against the wall. I didn't remember leaving it there. Then I found a shoe print, barefoot, wide heel, deep, to the right of the outhouse. It wasn't mine. I checked. I stopped sleeping well. I kept a knife next to the cot, and I started pissing in a bucket inside instead of going out after dark. The scratching came back every few nights, but now it was higher up, like something crawling along the wall or the roof. I never caught anything. Every time I went out, it was quiet. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was raccoons or wind, or maybe an old bum that had wandered out and didn't want trouble. I told myself a lot of things. But one day I hiked up the West Hill to get cell signal and called the county sheriff's office. I didn't tell them everything. I just said I thought someone was squatting on my land. They said they'd send someone out, but no one ever came. Or if they did, I never saw them. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not outside, inside. The sound of bare feet moving slowly across the wooden floor. My heart jumped so hard I thought it would stop. I sat up in the dark, not even breathing. I could feel the sweat already. The footsteps moved toward the table, paused, then back toward the door. I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen, gripping the knife. But I didn't turn on the flashlight. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to see. After maybe 30 seconds, the footsteps stopped. I waited in that silence for an hour. When I finally turned on the flashlight, the room was empty. Door still locked. But the bucket I used to piss in had been tipped over. That was it. Just tipped over with the lid off. I left it there and sat up until dawn. Knife in one hand, light in the other. I started sleeping in my truck after that. I moved the cot into the truck bed, covered it with a tarp, and parked the truck near the fence line where I could see the cabin from a distance. Every night I watched the windows. Some nights nothing happened. Other nights I thought I saw movement. Shadows inside, something passing in front of the window, but it was never clear. I thought I might be losing my mind. Then I went into the barn. It was about 3 weeks after the footsteps. I told myself I needed tools. I had to check. The big sliding door was rusted shut, but the side door opened with a hard push. It smelled like wet hay and something else. Something rotten. Inside, the air was thick. There were tools on the walls, most of them rusted. Chains, an old wheelbarrow, plastic bins full of cracked PVC pipe. But in the far corner, behind a stack of tires, was something that stopped me cold. It was a small sleeping area. A bed made of blankets and old feed sacks. A pile of food wrappers. Empty water bottles. Clothes all dirty. And a knife. A big one. The kind you don't just find. Next to it was a bag. An army-style duffel with a broken zipper, and inside were folded shirts, cans of soup, a flashlight, and a notepad. The notepad was full of scribbles. No words, just tight, angry loops drawn over and over on every page, pressed so hard the paper had torn in places. I left everything exactly as it was and backed out. Back at the truck, I packed my gear in under 10 minutes. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't wait to see who came back to the barn. I drove straight out, through the tall grass, bouncing over the uneven earth until I hit the gravel road that led back to the highway. I never told anyone the full story. I didn't want to deal with police reports or investigations. I just sold the property through an agency and left it at that. I don't know who was living there. I don't know if it was just one person or more, but someone had been living on that farm. In the walls, in the barn, maybe even the attic. I've thought about it a lot since then. What would have happened if I stayed one more week? What if I had tried to confront whoever it was? What if they'd gotten into the truck one night? I live in Idaho now. Quiet place, apartment, neighbors, locks on the doors. Sometimes, in the early morning, I still wake up thinking I hear footsteps. But I never go back to sleep until I check the room. It was the summer of 2017. I was 31 at the time, working in insurance in Leeds, and I needed a break. That year had been heavy. My mother had a fall back in February, and I was spending nearly every weekend traveling back and forth to Wakefield to help her out. Then in April, a coworker I was close to passed away suddenly from a heart condition. That kind of thing makes you feel like you're stuck in a loop, going to work, paying bills, watching people around you fall apart or disappear altogether. I didn't want to go on some flashy holiday abroad or stay in a hotel with a pool and a buffet. I just wanted to be alone, in nature, somewhere quiet. I wanted trees and fog and space to think. That's how I ended up renting a small cabin near Dartmoor in Devon. I found it online through a site that rented out rural homes and cottages, most of them owned by older couples or people who'd moved to the countryside to get away from city life. The listing had 2 photos. One showed the outside of the cabin, stone walls, a green tin roof, a tiny chimney. The other showed a bed, a table, and a wood-burning stove. That was all I needed. I booked it for a week, Monday to Monday. The place was about 15 miles outside of Tavistock, near the edge of the moor. The directions were specific. After leaving the A386, I had to take a narrow gravel road for about 20 minutes, pass an abandoned barn with ivy all over it, then turn left where the road curved around a dry stone wall. The owner's note said there'd be a wooden sign that just said cabin. No street name, no number. I arrived early Monday afternoon. It was cloudy, and the air felt damp even though it wasn't raining. I remember stepping out of my car and noticing how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet you get in the city at night. This was total silence. No humming traffic, no distant voices, no music leaking through windows. Just wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. The cabin was even smaller than I expected, but that was fine. One room with a single bed pushed against the wall, a little kitchen with a sink and kettle, a small table with 2 chairs and the wood stove. There was a toilet out back in a separate shack and a pump for water next to it. No phone service, no Wi-Fi. That was the point. I unpacked, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the porch for a bit, staring at the trees. Felt good to be away. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to do anything. The first few days were uneventful. I read, walked through the woods, made simple meals. I found a trail that led down to a little stream about half a mile from the cabin. I'd bring a book down there and sit on a rock, listening to the water. There were no houses nearby, not that I could see, just hills and woods and sky. But by Wednesday afternoon, things started to feel a little off. I had just come back from a long walk. It was maybe 4 in the afternoon. I was taking my boots off on the porch when I noticed something strange on the window. It was a smudge. At first I thought it was just dirt or condensation, but then I looked closer. It was a handprint, not mine, too small, and higher than where my own hand would naturally rest. 5 fingers, slightly spread out, clear as day. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. The trail I walked on didn't show signs of being used by others, and I locked the cabin every time I left. But there it was, a clear handprint on the outside of the glass. I wiped it off and tried not to think too much about it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, not from noise, just this weird feeling that I was being watched. At one point, around 2 or 3 a.m., I got up and looked out the window. The moon was out, and it lit up the woods in this pale, cold way. I didn't see anything unusual, but I stayed at the window for a long time, just looking into the trees. Thursday morning, I found footprints near the back of the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet, small ones, like a woman's or a teenager's. The ground was damp, so the prints were clear in the mud, heel, arch, toes. They went around the cabin and stopped near the back window. That rattled me. I tried to come up with reasons. Maybe there was a hiker who got lost. Maybe some local weirdo who liked sneaking around people's property. But that didn't make it better. That night, I locked everything again and moved the table in front of the door, just in case. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a soft crunching sound. Leaves or gravel underfoot. Stopped, then started again. Slow, careful steps, not an animal. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, holding my breath. Then the doorknob rattled. Not much, just a little twitch, like someone was testing it gently, trying not to make noise. I stayed perfectly still. The knob didn't move again. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally dozed off just before sunrise. In the morning, I checked the area. More footprints, same size. This time, I followed them into the trees. They went in a straight line for about 30 meters, then just stopped. The ground was all damp earth and moss. There was no way to walk there without leaving a trail, and yet the prints just ended. I turned back, shaken. That evening, I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to Leeds. But I didn't want to overreact. Could still all be nothing, just some strange coincidence. I convinced myself to stay. Friday night was the worst. It was raining light but steady, the kind of rain that makes everything quiet. I was in bed by 10, exhausted but tense. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same soft footsteps, the crunch of gravel, the rustle of wet leaves. Then tapping. On the window, light and slow. One tap, then a pause, then another. I froze. My back was to the window, but I didn't turn around. The tapping continued for what felt like 10 full minutes. Then it stopped. I stayed awake until the sky started to turn pale. Then I got up and looked out. There was something on the windowsill. A small piece of cloth, folded neatly. I opened the window just enough to grab it and pulled it inside. It was part of a dress. Old-fashioned, pale blue, with a white floral pattern. Damp and muddy. That was it. I was done. I packed everything in a rush. Threw my things in the boot of the car. Didn't even bother folding clothes. I didn't check the cabin again. I just drove. As I reached the main road, I passed the wooden sign I had seen on the way in. But now there was something written under the word cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp. It said, "She watches." I drove without stopping until I hit Exeter. I got a cheap hotel near the motorway and stayed there the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the room with the TV on low and the lights on. When I got back to Leeds, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not my coworkers, not my mom. I didn't want to talk about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about that place. So, a few weeks later, I looked up the listing again. It was gone. No trace. I tried reverse image searching the photo from the original post. Nothing came up. I even tried finding other cabins in the same area, hoping I could at least locate the spot on a map. Then I found something strange. A local newspaper archive from 2003. A small article about a missing woman near Dartmoor. Her name was Anne Halford. She was 29. She lived in Tavistock and had taken a weekend trip to a remote cabin just outside town. According to the article, her car was found parked on a gravel road. The cabin was empty, no signs of struggle, just her suitcase, untouched, and a piece of cloth found on the windowsill. Pale blue, floral pattern. I don't know what I saw out there, or who was walking around that cabin at night, but I know it wasn't my imagination. And I'm never going back. I was 31 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin up in northern Arizona, near a place called Cascade Ridge. I'd been through a tough stretch, long hours at work, a breakup that left me quiet and cold inside, and I felt like I hadn't really breathed in months. A coworker mentioned he had a family cabin tucked deep off some forestry road that hadn't been used in a while. He said if I didn't mind chopping some wood and boiling water from the creek, I could have it for free. That was enough for me. This was late October 2019. The weather had started to shift up there. Days were dry and cold. Nights dipped below freezing. The cabin was way off the grid, about a 3-hour drive from Flagstaff, then another hour down a gravel forestry road that twisted and narrowed the deeper I went. I remember that drive clearly, the way the pines grew thick on both sides of the road, the branches leaning in like they were hiding something. The signal on my phone dropped completely about 20 minutes in, and I didn't see another car from that point on. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense ponderosa pine forest. There were no neighbors, no power lines, no fences, just woods stretching out in every direction. It was a single-room structure with a slanted tin roof, a wood stove in the corner, and one small cot with an old mattress. Dust coated everything. There were mouse droppings in the corners. A stack of firewood sat under a tarp behind the cabin, and there was a dry outhouse about 50 feet out through the trees. I unpacked slowly, listening to the wind sift through the pine needles, that soft brushing sound that fills the space when there's no one else around. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent most of the time hiking, reading by the fire, or just sitting outside watching the forest. I started to fall into a quiet rhythm. Up early with the sun, coffee made on the small propane stove, long walks through the woods, and then back to the cabin to cook and settle in before dark. The trails around there weren't marked. I had a paper map with vague outlines and elevation marks, and I made sure to stay close to the cabin so I could always find my way back. But on the third day, something shifted. I had gone out later than usual, around 3 p.m., thinking I'd just do a short loop. The sun dipped early that time of year, so I told myself I'd be back in an hour. I followed a shallow ridge to the east and dropped down into a gulch I hadn't noticed before. The terrain was rougher, filled with boulders and old animal tracks. I saw elk droppings, maybe some coyote scat. I figured if I looped around the far end, I'd reconnect with a path I'd used the day before. But I kept walking. The gulch narrowed and the trees got thicker, older. The kind of forest that feels like it's holding its breath. I saw bones scattered near a dry creek bed. Nothing too strange, just what looked like deer remains, stripped clean. Then I saw a boot. It was off to the side, half buried in pine needles. Old and torn, laces gone. There were scratch marks on the leather like it had been clawed or chewed. Nearby, a torn shirt sleeve hung from a low branch. It looked faded and had a dark stain on one edge. I stood there a long time, just staring at it. My stomach tightened. I didn't like the feel of that place. Something about it felt wrong, like I was too far in, like I'd passed some invisible threshold. I turned back fast, trying to follow my footprints, but they were scattered, shallow in the dry soil, and the light was fading quick. I started walking faster, then jogging. The forest seemed different now, more still. I kept expecting to hear a squirrel or a bird, but there was nothing. Just the crunch of my own steps and the blood pounding in my ears. When I finally saw the outline of the cabin through the trees, it was already dusk. I was breathing hard, and my legs were sore. I went straight inside, lit the lantern, and locked the door. I didn't eat that night. I just sat by the fire with a blanket over my shoulders, listening. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunch of leaves. I froze. The fire had burned low. I got up slowly and turned the lantern off so I could see through the small window better. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows that moved gently in the breeze. Then I saw it. Something was standing near the outhouse. I couldn't see its face. It stood with its arms low, like they were too long for its body. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at the cabin. I don't know how long I watched it. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe more. My chest was tight. Every instinct I had screamed not to make a sound. Eventually, it turned. It didn't walk like a person. The shoulders twisted too far, the steps uneven. It moved like it was wearing someone else's skin. I couldn't see where it went, just faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found tracks in the frost, bare feet. No shoes, no boots, just long, narrow prints leading from the edge of the woods to the outhouse, then back again. I packed my bag that day. I didn't care if the trip was cut short. I was done, but the road out was blocked. A tree had fallen across the narrow forestry road, maybe 40 yards from the turnoff. It was huge, split near the base like it had been pushed, not cut. There were no chainsaw marks, no signs of rot. The thing looked healthy. I don't know how it had come down so clean. I got out and tried to drag some of the branches, but they were heavy and tangled. I realized fast that I wasn't getting around it without help. No phone signal, no radio. I had to go back to the cabin. That night was worse. Just after dark, I heard it again, this time closer. It circled the cabin, slow and steady. I kept the lantern off and watched from the shadows. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse, just movement between the trees. Then I heard it breathing, right outside the wall, low, raspy, like something was trying to smell through the wood. I didn't move. Hours passed. At one point, I thought I heard scratching under the floorboards, but I told myself it had to be mice. Had to be. In the morning, the frost was thick. I stepped out slowly, holding the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood. The ground near the door was disturbed. Something had paced back and forth in the dirt. I followed the prints around the side of the cabin. They stopped near the window. There, smeared across the glass, was a handprint, but it was wrong. The fingers were too long and the palm too narrow. I hiked out that day on foot with nothing but my pack and the hatchet. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just left. I followed the road down for miles until I found a ranger station. It was abandoned, locked up for the season, but there was a service shed with an old emergency radio. I got it working and called for help. A deputy came out that afternoon and drove me into town. I didn't say much, just that a tree had blocked the road and I'd gotten scared by animal tracks. He nodded like he'd heard it all before, but before he left, he asked where I'd been staying. I told him, the cabin near Cascade Ridge, the one past mile marker 42. He just looked at me and said, "That cabin's not on any recent maps." I haven't been back since. Whatever I saw out there wasn't a ghost or a monster. I don't believe in any of that, but there are things in the wild, men maybe, that choose to live outside the lines. People who shed names and language and rules. Things that mimic. Things that watch. You don't need fairy tales to be afraid. Just time, silence, and a forest big enough to hide in.